Hello again. Thanks for joining me. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 2 of Dolphins at Daybreak from the Magic Treehouse series, written by Mary Pope Osborne. But before we do that, let's do a quick recap of what happened yesterday in Chapter 1. So if you remember, yesterday in Chapter 1, Annie and Jack both had a dream that Morgan Le Fay told them that the treehouse was back. So they went back into the woods, and of course, the treehouse was there. And in the treehouse was Morgan. And she said that she needed their help, but first, before they could help, they needed to prove that they could be master librarians. And in order to do that, they had to solve a riddle. So she gave them a riddle on an ancient scroll, which is like a long piece of paper right there, and an ocean guidebook, and off they went to the ocean, or so they thought. So before we read Chapter 2 called The Reef, I just want to remind you that good readers, when they're listening to a story, especially a story that doesn't have a lot of pictures, they need to use the skill of visualization. So this question says, can you visualize this in your mind? And again, these kids were reading a story about knights and castles, so they're visualizing two different images in their mind. But as we're reading Chapter 2, The Reef today, I want you to visualize, and maybe you can even close your eyes and think about what you're hearing, and then make a picture or a movie in your mind of what's happening. That's what I like to do. Okay, so Chapter 2 is called The Reef. And I'll show you this picture before I read. Okay, here we go. A breeze blew through the window. Seagulls cried. Waves lapped the shore. Annie picked up the riddle scroll. She unrolled it. Together, she and Jack read the riddle. Rough and gray as rock, I'm plain as plain can be, but hidden deep inside, there's great beauty in me. What am I? Read that one more time. So they're trying to figure out what the riddle is talking about. Rough and gray as rock, I'm plain as plain can be, but hidden deep inside, there's great beauty in me. What am I? Let's go find the answer, said Annie. She and Jack looked out the window. The treehouse wasn't in a tree. It was on the ground. Why is the ground pink? Said Jack. I don't know, said Annie, but I'm going out there. I'm going to do a little research first. Annie climbed out of the treehouse. Jack picked up the ocean book and flipped through it. He found a picture of a pink island surrounded by water. He read, This is Coral Reef. Corals are tiny sea animals. After they die, their skeletons remain. Over time, the reef builds up from stacks of coral skeletons. Oh man, tiny skeletons, said Jack. He pulled out his notebook and wrote, millions of coral skeletons. Jack, come look at this, cried Annie. What is it? I don't know, but you'll love it, she said. Jack threw his notebook and the ocean book into his pack. He climbed out the window. So in my mind, I'm visualizing Jack putting all his stuff in his backpack, and then he's climbing out the window to race to Annie, and she's somewhere on this pink sandy beach. Hope you were visualizing the same thing too. Is it the answer to the riddle? He called. I don't think so. It doesn't look very plain, said Annie. She was standing at the edge of the water. Beside her was a strange-looking machine. Jack hurried over the bumpy coral to get a better look. The machine was half on the reef and half in the clear blue water. It looked like a huge white bubble with a big window. Is it a special kind of boat? Asked Annie. Jack found a picture of the machine in the ocean book. He read, Scientists who study the ocean are called oceanographers. Sometimes they travel in small diving vessels called submersibles or mini subs to study the ocean floor. We learned about that in our background building last week. It's a mini sub, said Jack. He pulled out his notebook. Let's get inside it, said Annie. No, said Jack. Actually, he did want to see what the sub looked like inside, but he shook his head. We can't. It's not ours. Just a tiny peek, said Annie. It might help us figure out the riddle. Jack sighed. Okay, but we have to be careful. Don't touch anything, he said. What do you think? Make a prediction. Does Annie usually follow Jack's directions? Don't worry, said Annie. And take off your shoes so they won't get wet, said Jack. He and Annie slipped off their shoes and socks and threw them toward the treehouse. Then they stepped carefully over the sharp coral. Annie turned the handle on the hatch of the mini sub. It opened. She and Jack climbed inside. The hatch slammed shut. The mini sub was tiny. 2 seats faced the big window. In front of the seats was a computer built into a control panel. Annie sat down. Here's a picture of what the sub looked like and them getting in. Jack opened the ocean book and read more on the mini sub page. Mini subs have strong hulls to keep air in and protect those aboard from water pressure. Computers are used to guide the mini sub through the ocean. Oops, said Annie. What's wrong? Jack looked up. Annie was waving her hands in front of the computer. Now the screen showed a map. What's going on? Said Jack. I just pressed a few keys, said Annie. What? I said not to touch anything, said Jack. An air blower came on. The mini sub jerked backward. Get out, said Jack. He and Annie scrambled for the hatch. Jack grabbed the handle, but they were too late. The mini sub slid off the reef. Then it dove silently down into the deep. I was predicting that Annie would not be able to follow Jack's instructions, and sure enough, she didn't. So I want you to talk with somebody about what just happened in chapter 2, and then I want you to write 2 juicy sentences about what happened in this chapter. And then tomorrow we'll see what happens in chapter 3 called Mini Sub. All right, thanks for listening.